Have you ever gotten news that you just couldn't believe? Something so unexpected, so out of the blue, that you just couldn't wrap your mind around the fact that it was actually happening. Most of the time, shocking things like that happen to us are personal things that affect us more than other people. But sometimes those difficult things to believe are sometimes things that affect a whole city or a country or in the entire world. Next Sunday will be September 11th, and I'm sure that we all remember where we were 21 years ago on that morning of September 11th, 2001. I was working security at the college that I attended in Southern California, and I worked the graveyard shift from midnight until 8 in the morning. I was walking around doing my rounds, unlocking doors, when about 5:50 in the morning, a lady who worked in the cafeteria parked her car in the parking lot. And as I said good morning, as she was walking by, she mentioned that she heard on the radio that a plane had just crashed into the World Trade Center in New York. And in my mind, I pictured a small Cessna type plane that might have broken a few windows or started a small fire. But then I went into the lobby of the men's dorm where there was a TV, and I turned on the news. And of course, the damage was much worse than what I had pictured in my mind. The newscasters were confused, trying to come up with some kind of answer about how a commercial airliner could have gotten so off course. And about 5 minutes later, I watched as the second plane, United Airlines Flight 175, crashed into the South Tower. And immediately there was no question that these planes crashed, that it wasn't an accident. The rest of the day was a blur of calling family and loved ones, watching the latest news updates, planning and trying to figure out if we were in danger and what could happen next. It was like the world turned upside down, and it was confusing and it was scary. And just like everyone else, I kept asking myself, how can this be happening? At times in life like that, whether it's a personal tragedy or a national one, we're often left with a lot more questions than answers. Why is this happening to me? How could you let this happen, God? When is this going to end? Can things ever be the same again? And these questions are nothing new. People have been asking these questions for thousands of years when hard times have come. And today, as we start a new series on this small Old Testament book of Habakkuk, we'll see that this man and his nation were going through a hard time. Habakkuk is one of what are often called the minor prophets. Many scholars believe that Habakkuk would have been a contemporary of other prophets like Nahum and Zephaniah and Jeremiah. And after King Salem died, the nation of Israel split into two kingdoms, the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. And both kingdoms had trouble staying true to who God had called them to be. And ultimately, the northern kingdom fell. But Habakkuk was a prophet to the southern kingdom of Judah. And prophets in those days often spoke to God for the people and communicated to the people on behalf of God. They were sort of a go-between or a mouthpiece for the communication between God and his people. And that meant that the prophets were often telling the people things that they didn't want to hear. And that meant that being a prophet could be a dangerous business in those days. Many prophets were abused, rejected, or even killed. Hebrews 11, 36 through 38 describes the prophets this way. It says, some faced jeers and flogging and even chains and imprisonment. They were put to death by stoning. They were sawed in two. They were killed by the sword. They went about in sheepskins and goatskins, destitute, persecuted, and mistreated. The world was not worthy of them. They wandered in deserts and mountains, living in caves and in holes in the ground. These guys had to be completely committed to their calling from God to be prophets. But as we start out looking at Habakkuk today, we'll see that he doesn't just challenge the nation or even a king. Habakkuk has some pointed questions for God and how he is working out his will with his people. So let's start out by reading Habakkuk chapter 1, verses 1 through 4. It says, the prophecy that Habakkuk the prophet received. How long, Lord, must I call for help, but you do not listen? Or cry out to you violence, but you do not save? Why do you make me look at injustice? Why do you tolerate wrongdoing? Destruction and violence are before me. There is strife and conflict abounds. Therefore the law is paralyzed and justice never prevails. The wicked hem in the righteous so that justice is perverted. Can any of you relate to the way that Habakkuk is feeling here? You ever feel like asking God those same questions? How long are you going to let these things happen, God? How many times do I have to watch something like this happen right in front of me? Why aren't you doing anything? I know I have those types of questions for God from time to time. And oftentimes we can feel guilty or wrong when we have those feelings or questions for God. But Habakkuk shows us here that it's not a sin to not understand God's plan. We're never going to fully be able to understand and grasp the complexities and intricacies of how God works in this world. And when God seems to be overlooking our situation, it can cause us to be frustrated and confused. And when we read Habakkuk's complaint here to God, we can really feel his frustration. He's watching people in his own nation, people who are supposed to be living by God's law, and they're abusing and mistreating each other. Look at the words that Habakkuk uses here, words like violence, injustice, wrongdoing, strife, conflict. And those words are words that we could use to describe our world and our society today, aren't they? Descriptions like that don't seem too far off, but really, those are words that could be used to describe every culture and every society that's ever existed. Where there are people, there is going to be wrongdoing and strife and conflict. But God has created us, in us, a desire for righteousness and a hunger to work for what's right. When we look around and we see things that are unjust and go against God's will, it seems like there's sometimes nothing we can do to change it. And when that's true, we feel that same frustration. And we have those same questions that Habakkuk had. How could you let this happen, God? Why don't you do something? And you don't have to look very far to find things that make us ask those questions today. Suffering, or even the murder of innocent children, the division that we see in our country, politically and culturally and racially. Drug issues that seem to be raging out of control and overdoses, the problems with anxiety and depression that seem to be at epidemic levels, financial issues that make it hard for some of us to put food on the table, crime, war, natural disasters, you name it. There are plenty of reasons for us to ask God, what's going on here? And like I said, Habakkuk is seeing violence and injustice being inflicted on God's people by their own people. And unfortunately for us, some of the suffering and struggles that we face can be because of those people closest to us. Some of us have been abused or manipulated or taken advantage of by people in our own family. Some of us have been betrayed by people that we thought we should be able to trust. Some of us have been neglected and overlooked by people who were supposed to watch over us and protect us. Some of us may have even been the ones doing those things to other people. And that's what is frustrating Habakkuk. God had set the Jewish people apart. They were his chosen people. They were supposed to live in a way that demonstrated his goodness and his glory and his provision to the nations around them. But as Habakkuk describes in his complaint to God, the kingdom of Judah is just like everyone else. People are hurting each other, taking advantage of each other, and rejecting the way that God had commanded them to live. They've rejected their calling, and there's no distinction between them and the other nations around them. And for us as the church, as Christians, there's a lesson here. Under the new covenant, we, the church, are called to live in a way and treat each other in a way that reflects God's goodness and his glory and his righteousness to the world around us. We have been set apart. We have been sanctified by Jesus. But oftentimes the church doesn't look or act very much differently than the world around us. Churches fight about things that don't matter. They put their perspective in the wrong place. People are worried about getting their own way rather than God having his way. There have been churches that split over things like choosing the color of the carpet or disagreements about what kind of church van they should buy. And it's nothing new. When we look at the New Testament, a lot of the books that we have there were letters to churches, and in almost all of them, there are instructions on how to deal with disagreements and people treating each other badly in the church. I've often described the church as God's perfect plan being carried out by imperfect people. But even though we're not perfect, even though there have been and will continue to be problems in the church since the very beginning, we still have to work our hardest to be different, to be set apart, to be people, and to be a church that God has called us to be. In Ephesians 4, 1-3, Paul writes this to the church in Ephesus. As a prisoner for the Lord, then I urge you to live a life worthy of the calling you have received. Be completely humble and gentle. Be patient, bearing with one another in love. Make every effort to keep the unity of the Spirit through the bond of peace. And Jesus, when he prays for us, he prays for our unity. And that's his prayer because he knows that our unity is essential if the world is going to understand his gospel. In John 17, 22 and 23, Jesus prays this: I have given them the glory that you gave me, that they may be one as we are one, I and them and you and me, so that they may be brought to complete unity. Then the world will know that you sent me and have loved them even as you have loved me. Let it never be said of us that we, as parts of this body, this church, ever treat anyone in a way that would make them cry out to God and ask him how his people could possibly act so unlike who he's called them to be. I pray that we as a church would be humble, gentle, patient, loving, and bound together in peace because of the unity we have in Jesus, so that the world can look at us and see the evidence that we have been set apart and made new through the power of Jesus. But that's not what's happening with God's people in Habakkuk's day. There's division and injustice, and Habakkuk is looking for answers. But what we see next shows us God's answers might be something that we don't want. The old saying, be careful what you ask for because you just might get it, really is true. Oftentimes, when we come to God asking for his intervention or for him to do something, we don't really know what we're asking. And that's because our requests are almost always limited by the fact that we can only see what's right in front of us, while God has an eternal and kingdom perspective. And our expectations are usually based on what we think would be best and easiest and most expedient for us. But as we read on in Habakkuk, we see that God's plans are usually not what we expect. So let's read God's response to Habakkuk's complaints here in verses 6 through 11. It says, look at the nations and watch and be utterly amazed, for I am going to do something in your days that you would not believe even if you were told. I am raising up the Babylonians, that ruthless and impetuous people who sweep across the whole earth to seize dwellings not their own. They are a feared and dreaded people. They are a law to themselves and promote their own honor. Their horses are swifter than leopards, fiercer than wolves at dusk. Their cavalry gallops headlong. Their horsemen come from afar. They fly like an eagle, swooping to devour. They all come intent on violence. Their hordes advance like a desert wind and gather prisoners like sand. They mock kings and scoff at rulers. They laugh at all fortified cities. By building earthen ramps, they capture them. Then they sweep past like the wind and go on. Guilty people whose own strength is their God. This can't be the answer that Habakkuk was expecting or hoping for. Basically, God just said, I hear your complaints, I understand your frustration, but don't worry, I have a plan. And that plan is for the marauding hordes of your worst enemy to sweep in, defeat you, and haul you off into exile. Not a very rosy picture of what is to come for Habakkuk and the kingdom of Judah, but look at what God says right at the beginning of this answer. He says, I am going to do something that you wouldn't even believe if I told you. And we're the same, aren't we? When we're in the midst of struggles and confusion, we almost always can't imagine how things could ever get better. Some of the things in life that help us to learn and to grow the most are the things that we wouldn't choose on our own because they're some of the most difficult things. But when we go through trials, we're stronger and we're able to see from a more mature perspective that we almost certainly wouldn't come to on our own. But God's able to see the strength that we can build through the struggle. He's able to see the refining that can be done in our lives when we go through the fire. He's able to see the perseverance that can grow in us when we face trials. And he's able to see the fruit that can be produced in our life when we're pruned by difficult circumstances. Let's look back at what Habakkuk was complaining about his people doing. He was upset because they were neglecting the law, that justice was being perverted, and that they were ignoring God. Now look at what God says about the Babylonians. He says they're a law unto themselves and that their own strength is their God. Basically, the Babylonians are the kingdom of Judah on steroids. They've taken all the things that Judah is doing wrong to the extreme. And God is saying, since you have rejected my commands, you've twisted the law, you've perverted justice, I'm going to let you experience the result of what that kind of kingdom is like. God's going to allow his people to go through something very difficult so that they can have the strength to be the people he's called them to be. Habakkuk is shocked by God's answer and by his plan, and he can't see how this could be the best way to handle things. And let's read Habakkuk's response to God in verses 12 through 17. He says, Lord, are you not from everlasting? My God, my Holy One, you will never die. You, Lord, have appointed them to execute judgment. You, my rock, have ordained them to punish. Your eyes are too pure to look on evil. You cannot tolerate wrongdoing. Why then do you tolerate the treacherous? Why are you silent while the wicked swallow up those more righteous than themselves? You have made people like the fish in the sea, like the sea creatures that have no ruler. The wicked foe pulls all of them up with hooks and catches them in his net. He gathers them up in his dragnet. And so he rejoices and is glad. Therefore he sacrifices to his net and burns incense to his dragnet. For by his net he lives in luxury and enjoys the choicest food. Is he to keep on emptying his net, destroying nations without mercy? You can hear, and I think we can understand Habakkuk's confusion here. He acknowledges God's ordained this to happen, but he still can't understand why. He basically says that these Babylonians worship their own power, that they're not going to give any credit to God. And Habakkuk can't understand why God would allow them to have victory and gain glory for themselves. But even though he doesn't understand why God would do things this way, Habakkuk shows us something very important as he continues in verse 1 of chapter 2. He demonstrates for us that even when we don't understand God's plan, we can still choose to trust him. After Habakkuk questions God, after he lays out his objections to what God has told him is going to happen, he can choose to try to run from God's plan. He could choose to ignore God's plan and try to force his own agenda, but let's see what he does. Habakkuk chapter 2, verse 1 says this, I will stand at my watch and station myself on the ramparts. I will look to see what he will say to me and what answer I am to give to this complaint. Habakkuk doesn't understand why God would choose to accomplish his will through a violent pagan nation. He doesn't want things to happen the way that God has planned. He still has questions. He still has complaints, but he chooses to stand on his faith. He chooses to trust God and to stay true to his calling. Even though he doesn't like what God has said, Habakkuk says, I will stand firm and I will look to see what God will do. And that's the choice we have too. We can try to run from difficulties. We can try to shortcut God's plan, or we can choose to stand firm and look for what God will do. And if you're going through struggles right now, I know it's not easy. If you don't understand what God is doing or why he doesn't seem to be doing anything, I want to encourage you to take those concerns to God, those questions to him. Be honest with him about how you're feeling and your desire to know his will. God understands how you feel. He knows your situation. He knows your heart. But I also want to encourage you to stand firm, to choose to wait and watch and seek him, to look for what God can teach you through these struggles, to allow him to shape you and refine you and strengthen you as you trust him and his will. And if we do, we don't have to fear struggles in life, but we can anticipate what good fruit God can produce in us as we trust him and continue to seek his will. Let's pray. Father, thank you that in struggles in this life, we are not alone. And really, in our heart of hearts, if we're honest, we would probably say that we would want to avoid all struggles and hardships in life if we possibly could. And we know that that's not possible. Sometimes we don't understand why you let things happen the way that they happen. But we know that you are faithful through even difficult times. And we know that we can grow and learn and be strengthened and grow closer to you and have our faith built as we go through hard times. And it is a temptation for us to want to run, for us to want to reject your will or your plan when it doesn't seem to be what we want it to be. But we ask that you would help us to stand firm and to not pretend that things aren't difficult and that we have questions, but to choose to say, I will stand and watch and see what God will do. We thank you that you understand us, that you can accept our frustrations and our questions, and that you are faithful to us. And we ask that you would strengthen us and help us to be faithful to you as well. And we give you the glory and the honor that you're due even in difficult times, because we know that you can and do work all things together for good for those who are called according to your purpose. And we want to be people who are called according to your purpose and who want to see your will done in our lives. And we ask all of that in the name of Jesus. Amen.